Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Okay, so anybody have any possibly paranormal experiences themselves? No creepypasta, just first hands. Doesn't have to be a big story. I once went on a very supernatural bow hunt in the upper part of my state. Started off normal enough. I drove my truck in and set up my tent and camp in general. Unloaded my horses and secured them between two trees in the usual fashion. At the end of the day, I had a hot cup of coffee and cooked myself some steak and eggs and dozed off. I woke up the next day, cooked breakfast, took a couple practice shots at a target I brought with me to warm up and set off. This is when things started to get creepy. I walked up some of the usual game trails, and all day I didn't find anything. No fresh sign, no bugles, and not a single sign of the elk that were usually in the area. I attributed it to the fact that there had been a large hunt before mine, and went back to camp. When I got there, my horses were yanking at their tether, and seemed more than a little spooked. I also dismissed this, thinking they were just restless. So I put my pack down and brought them to a nearby stream to drink. At first they wouldn't drink at all. They only stared into the woods. I eventually got them to drink, but every now and again they would suddenly look up very alert, as if there was something in the woods. After getting back to camp, I cooked dinner and went to sleep, as per usual. The next day I ventured out with the same luck. No sign of elk at all. Only this time I noticed nothing else was making noise. No birds chirping, no chipmunks chittering. It was like the forest was dead. I went back to camp a little discouraged and followed the normal routine. The horses were even more spooked and acting strange. Now that night was really riveting. No matter how I try to explain it, something just doesn't add up. I went to bed and was awoken in the middle of the night to my horses screaming and thrashing around. I grabbed my sidearm and went outside in my underwear. There were tracks all over my camp, like something had been wandering around messing with things. And more often than not, they stopped where there was a window on my tent to ventilate smoke, which was half open. The horses were absolutely terrified, and everything outside was knocked over. The weirdest thing yet was that my target, which I had been practicing with twice every day, was gone. I was a little spooked, but attributed it to camp thieves and went back to sleep with my sidearm close by. The next day, I secured everything safely in my tent and took a look around camp before heading out. My horses never stopped staring at the woods. It was a cold day and still the forest was dead. I was taking a hike up one of the normal game trails I hunted on, and suddenly I stopped. Sitting right there in the middle of the trail was my practice target. It was just sitting there set up like I had it in camp when I shot at it. I examined the target but refused to carry it back to camp with me. I simply set it off the trail and returned to camp, more than a little spooked. I tried to water my horses, but they absolutely refused to move from where they stood or even go near the woods. This is when I started to realize there really was something out there. That night my fears were soothed a bit when I heard coyotes outside howling, which would explain my spooked horses. Later that night I awoke to a bunch of coyotes screeching. They were obviously playing, so I went back to bed. I woke up the next day and tried a different area, a small ravine I had left untouched so far. About halfway up the ravine, I heard something move away from me, breaking a stick or two and moving rather fast as it went. This really upped my spirits. I had just spooked an elk. I stalked it for the rest of that day, but never caught up to it. I went to bed that night with high spirits and decided to stay another day despite all that had happened. I awoke that next day and went to that same ravine. I stalked it for several hours before I caught a sign of movement. Something bolted away from me up onto the ridge. I only caught a glimpse of it, but it looked to have a tan hide. Needless to say, I went after it. I hiked up onto the ridge as quietly as I could, and the wind was also in my favor. It was the best stalk I had ever made. As I reached the top of the ridge, I heard something circling around in some oak bushes just beyond a group of trees. Perfect. I would have a great shot on the only elk I had encountered the entire hunt. It couldn't have been more than 40 yards beyond the group of trees. I snuck up to the trees as quietly as I could, hiding myself between the last tree. I nocked an arrow and began to pivot around the tree when I froze dead in my tracks. Partway around the tree was the carcass of not one, but two coyotes. This definitely brought me back to reality, and I was suddenly very afraid. I had no idea what was on the other side of that tree. I took a befuddled step backward and made a critical error. I snapped a fallen branch behind me. I froze, afraid to do anything else, and the circling stopped as well. There was silence for several more moments, when I heard whatever was on the other side of that tree start to silently creep towards me. There was no question about what to do. I bolted. I tailed it out of that ravine as fast as I could, thinking I heard something behind me the whole way. Could have been paranoia, though. I got back to camp and packed up as fast as I could and left, looking over my shoulder the whole time. When I got home, my wife hugged me with tears in her eyes. Apparently, someone on that hunt had died in a hunting accident, but their name wasn't released. I never did find out what was on the other side of that tree.
I've had a few weird things happen to me in an old house before. It's a tiny white house my grandmother used to live in, that we moved into when we were between houses. The first thing that ever happened to me there was before we moved into the house. It had fallen into a bit of disrepair and we were doing some renovation, part of it professional and part of it done by us. A week or so before we got started, we were standing in the backyard talking to relatives. We were discussing what needed to be done to the house, when I noticed a roughly 10 by 10 foot cloud or fog rush across the length of the yard, between the trees that bordered it. There was no wind, and I was later told that the old vegetable garden it flew over was the spot my great-grandfather died in. He had a stroke doing evening gardening. When I told my father about what I had seen, he told me he had experienced something as well back when he was a child. He had been 10 or so when his grandfather died, and often spent weekends at the house to keep his grandmother company after the death. He told me how, for years afterward, they would both wake up in the middle of the night hearing my grandfather's cane and bad leg coming down the hallway. A 6-foot hallway. But they never saw anything. After that, things got a little weirder. Between renovations, the little motion sensors we had set up inside, in case of break-ins, constantly went off. We knew, because people who were doing landscaping outside told us they heard concrete drills running inside, and were curious how the workers had locked themselves in the house. That was the noise the motion sensors made. Nobody was in the house. A week or two later, we were resurfacing the floors with floor sanders, the really loud kind. As it turns out, whatever was in that house hated loud noise. The more I ran the sander, the worse this horrible sense of enclosing dread made it almost impossible for me to move. But I wasn't even alone. My parents weren't more than 15 feet away, in the hallway behind me, and at one point, even in the same room, but somehow, I felt just as scared for them as I did myself. And I started hearing a sort of static behind all the noise I was making, like the feeling you get before lightning strikes. This was the most scared I had ever been in my life. Eventually I had to stop, but that room felt angry for at least a week afterwards. A little creepier, though, was the kitchen. For a few months after we first moved in, it was like a room of echoes. Walking through it, you would find yourself reliving a conversation you had just had, almost as though you were talking to someone in your head. This came to a head one day after my girlfriend had come by that night to do some studying. We walked through the kitchen to her car, and she left. On the way back in, I clearly heard her call my name both inside and outside my head. I smiled and turned around, thinking she had forgotten something and come back for it. But of course she had been gone for several minutes then. Then I realized the sound had come from right in my ear, inside my head, with the door locked behind me. Didn't sleep well that night. Of course there were lots of little things like lights getting turned on when we left the house. We'd notice just as we were getting in the car. Or creeping mists in the front and backyard. My father told me that several times he woke up hearing odd noises or even feeling something slap his feet. Once he heard me creeping around his bed, pretended to sleep, then tried to reverse the scare and leapt out of bed. Except I wasn't in his room, I wasn't even home. As he stood there, he remembered I was at my dorm 45 minutes away, and he was home alone. I don't think he slept very well that night, either. The last odd things I remember happening in that house involved a small dog a friend frequently brought over. Most evenings would be normal, but occasionally the dog would see something we didn't and chase it around the house. Now this is normal dog behavior, as I understand it, but the odd thing was that the dog would sometimes chase whatever it was to a closed door. And then, sometimes, the motion sensor on the other side of the door would go off. All the motion sensors faced into their rooms, away from the doors, so the dog couldn't have tripped them. Or other times, the dog would chase whatever it was out of our line of sight. Then yelp, and run back so fast it rammed into things trying to get back to us. I'm glad we ended up moving out.
Have had a couple of paranormal experiences in my life, but one of the most intense and distinguishing ones that I've had was a couple of years ago when I was in high school. My cross-country team had gone on an overnight meet somewhere in deep southern Georgia, and we stayed at log cabins in the middle of the woods next to a lake and the race course. We were in the middle of some park and there were gators in the lake that you could clearly notice. Anyways, we stayed one night and the team was told to stay a certain radius around the camp. The moon was out, so me and two other friends of mine decided to walk a trail we had seen through the woods. At first it seemed like a good idea until we revealed that it was pitch black in the woods thanks to the massive amount of trees, kinda like threads of a cloth woven together. We hadn't treaded long when suddenly we were overwhelmed with an intense presence. Like some great kind of pressure had just instantly surrounded and pressed substantially. My blood pumped and my mind went into overdrive as the adrenaline flowed. My senses for some reason became flooded and I could almost hardly think for seconds before I was fine. My friends froze too. Ahead of the trail was a small sliver of moonlight that had managed to penetrate the woods. I noticed a faded silhouette in the light. Barely, but I knew something was there and it was the same. For a couple of moments we stood there in a somewhat eerie silence save the forest inhabitants around us, trying to figure out what it was. Definitely some sort of spirit, as it didn't feel malevolent at all. Eventually my friends had enough that we had to leave.
Other than the usual little things that pretty much everyone on here's experienced, I can remember 3 very distinct instances where I've experienced what I consider the paranormal. 1. A few years back in that space just after high school graduation and just before going off to college, I was heading out to pick up a friend at about 8-9 at night. At the time I didn't have my own car, so I had to head out back to use my mother's minivan. We live in a fairly well-populated neighborhood, have neighbors across the backyard, but there's some tall evergreens that screen our yard from theirs. I hadn't had a problem with walking out there at night before, other than when I was very young and didn't like the dark. But it was odd, the minute I walked out the door that night, the whole area just felt wrong. It was fine inside the house just a second ago. And I looked at the grouping of evergreens and I got the impression that whatever it was that was giving off this horrid presence was in there, but there wasn't anything visibly there. Anyway, I try to brush the feeling off and take a few steps towards the car when suddenly I just stopped moving. It was like I was frozen to the spot, with this horrible wrong feeling all around me, pressing in on me. That's when it felt like whatever it was had suddenly taken notice of me, rooting me to the spot with its gaze. I had an impression of how it looked now in my head, though I generally believe that was probably just my mind going into oh shit mode. I'll describe it later if anyone's interested. Anyways, I stood like that for a while, dropping enough bricks to add a new wing to the house behind me, before managing to override my panic and bolt for the car. Whatever it was continued to watch me. I slammed the door shut and tried to turn the car on. In the car, trying to get keys and ignition, which is not easy to do when you're shaking hard. But the worst part was, when I was trying to jam the keys in the start, whatever it was walked up to the car, and was now peering in the driver's side window. There was nothing visibly there still, but I knew it was pressing its eyes against the window, not doing anything to me, just watching with an intensity that made my stomach turn. I started the car, managed not to smack into the corner of our garage, and hauled ass out of there nearly in tears. I picked my friend up, we drove around a while to let me rant and settle down, and when I drove back, whatever it was gone, but my friend said the air felt odd, like it was buzzing with energy. That's the first encounter I ever had. The next 2 aren't as scary, at least not to me, but still pretty X-worthy. 2. A while after that, I was sitting at my computer in the room that faces the backyard where the previous unseeable thing had been. I had heard some scurrying and scratching around outside the back screen door, and the porch light was on as well. I didn't see anything out there, but we had a lot of chipmunks and squirrels living around our house, so I just assumed it was some of them running around after dark. Anyway, I got up and closed the inner main door that sits behind the screen, and locked it for the night. I sat back down at the computer, and not more than 5 minutes later, this ungodly low, guttural growl came from right inside the now closed door. The hair went up on the back of my neck and I bolted for my room. I slammed my shoulder so hard against the corner of the doorway it bruised up black the next day, but it didn't even slow me down that night. I ran in my room, got my boot knife and got my dad. But nothing was outside or in the house. Thankfully, I never heard anything like that again, and dear God, I hope I never do. And finally, my third and last major paranormal experience. I was in Indiana at the time, and my grandmother had just had a stroke which she would some 2 or so weeks later die from. I had flown up with my mother to visit my grandmother while she still had some conscious brain function left, to hopefully help her recovery, and generally just support other members of the family. It was just my mother and I at the time, as my father had to stay at home for work, and my sister was off at college. Anyway, we had been at the hospital pretty much off and on all day, staying either by her side or hanging out with family there or at my aunt's nearby house. It had been a long, painful day, and so my mother and I crashed when we got to the hotel. Incidentally, we were either in or next to the room my grandmother had had her stroke in the day before. Weird. Anyway, I wasn't really all that tired, since I'd slept on the plane and a bit at my aunt's house, so I wasn't surprised when I woke up in the middle of the night. However, I heard my mother muttering and grinding her teeth in her sleep in the bed next to mine, and leaned halfway out of mine to poke at her to make her stop, as it was pretty damn creepy muttering. I couldn't get her to stop, and I was just going to flop back down in bed when I caught something in motion out of the corner of my eye. I slowly turned my head and watched as this human-sized shadow figure glided across the floor in front of our beds. It stopped at the head of our beds in the space between them and just stood there. Other than a defined head and shoulder shape, it just went straight down to the floor in a curtain of darkness. I have never seen anything as dark as this. It was like it somehow pulled light away from the edges around it, even in the pitch-black room we were in. I stared at it a moment, then began to reach my hand up defensively just in case, when it seemed to become startled, and bolted out the window. The rest is pretty much typical. My mother would not wake up enough for me to explain what I saw. She did stop the creepy muttering though. We stayed there a few more days, and on the day we left, not long after we had left her side, my grandmother slipped out of consciousness and never came back out of it. She died about a week later, but peacefully, and surrounded by my mother's 3 sisters. We had gone home that very day, thinking she would hold on long enough for us to get home and back again. So, that's pretty much it for me. Other stuff happened, but it's just little things and nothing that people don't already post pretty frequently about on here.
I've had a few disturbing experiences at my boyfriend's house. 1. We were laying around on his bed, which is parallel to his closet. His closet is the kind with 2 sliding doors. They're not really doors, though. They're huge mirrors. The lights were off, the only source of illumination being his computer monitor. As we're laying there, I'm watching the room in the mirror. I moved one of my arms, and in the mirror, I see a white object sort of like the leg of a corpse almost falling out from under the covers and off the bed. I checked the floor and under the covers, but nothing was there. When I looked in the mirror again, the white object was gone. 2. Same night, about 5 minutes later, I was staring at the mirror again. I saw my boyfriend raise his head up and smile. Still slightly freaked from the last thing the mirror did, I asked him if he just looked up and smiled at me in the mirror. He gave me a weird look and turned on the lights. We didn't speak of the incident again that evening until I was headed home, at which point he told me that he had not looked at me in the mirror. I tend to chalk up these experiences to being tired, but when I talk to the boyfriend about it, he says he's had similar things happen, which makes me wonder.
I live in a small little residential town in the middle of the Mojave Desert Antelope Valley in Southern California. It's called Lake Los Angeles, and was built over an Indian burial ground. When I was about 2, my aunt told me she saw a large, black figure walking from my mom's room across the hall to what used to be my room before I moved out. Then, in 2004, the cupboard door in the bathroom, closest to the door, was opening and slamming on its own on the 3rd of July. It did this all night, with a few pauses of maybe about 5-10 minutes. Also, when I was 3 or 4, I was sleeping in my mom's room and she had already left for work. She worked the early shift and left around 2 a.m. I was woken up by a lot of voices. My mom's room was messy and there were a lot of papers and like letters and such on the floor. I could hear them rustling around as if there were people walking around the room, but there was nothing there. Last thing I can remember was when I was 6, I was woken up by what sounded like a powwow. A Native American dance. There's an Indian museum on the butte behind my mom's house, and they have powwow festivals a couple times a year. And it looked like there was a camp-type fire outside my window, you know, the orange glow and stuff. When I opened the blinds there was nothing there and everything stopped. This happened a few times that night, and I even woke my aunt up to have her look, but like before, there was nothing out there. The next day there was a broken stone arrowhead outside my window that looked very, very old, that hadn't been there before. Not really creepy, but still paranormal. One year, at one of the powwows during summer in the middle of a really, really bad drought, the Native American shaman did a rain dance. He said give it 3 days and there would be rain. Sure enough, 3 days later there was rain. And the weather forecast for that third morning said it would be a hot, dry day. It poured down buckets.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.